The second detention. You have to leave later on today, La Gorda said to me right after breakfast. Since you have decided to go with us, you have committed yourself to helping us fulfill our new task. The Nagual left me in charge only until you came. He entrusted me, as you already know, with certain things to tell you. I've told you most of them. But there are still some I couldn't mention to you until you made your choice. Today we will take care of them. Right after that you must leave in order to give us time to get ready. We need a few days to settle everything and to prepare to leave these mountains forever. We have been here a very long time. It's hard to break away. But everything has come to a sudden end. The Nagual warned us of the total change that you would bring, regardless of the outcome of your bouts, but I think no one really believed him. I fail to see why you have to change anything, I said. I've explained it to you already, she protested. We have lost our old purpose. Now we have a new one, and that new purpose requires that we become as light as the breeze. The breeze is our new mood. It used to be the hot wind. You have changed our direction. You are talking in circles, Gorda. Yes, but that's because you're empty. I can't make it any clearer. When you return, the Genros will show you the art of the stalker, and right after that all of us will leave. The Nagual said that if you decide to be with us, the first thing I should tell you is that you have to remember your bouts with Soldad and the Little Sisters and examine every single thing that happened to you with them, because everything is an omen of what will happen to you on your path. If you are careful and impeccable, you'll find that those bouts were gifts of power. What's Donna Soldad going to do now? She's leaving. The Little Sisters have already helped her to take her floor apart. That floor aided her to reach her attention of the Nagual. The lines had power to do that. Each of them helped her gather a piece of that attention. To be incomplete is no handicap to reaching that attention for some warriors. Soldad was transformed because she got to that attention faster than any of us. She doesn't have to gaze at her floor anymore to go into that other world, and now that there is no more need for the floor, she has returned it to the earth where she got it. You are really determined to leave, Gorda, aren't you? All of us are. That's why I'm asking you to go away for a few days to give us time to pull down everything we have. Am I the one who has to find a place for all of you, Gorda? If you were an impeccable warrior you would do just that. But you're not an impeccable warrior, and neither are we. But still we will have to do our best to meet our new challenge. I felt an oppressive sense of doom. I have never been one to thrive on responsibilities. I thought that the commitment to guide them was a crushing burden that I could not handle. Maybe we don't have to do anything, I said. Yes. That's right, she said, and laughed. Why don't you tell yourself that over and over until you feel safe? The Nagual told you time and time again that the only freedom warriors have is to behave impeccably. She told me how the Nagual had insisted that all of them understand that not only was impeccability freedom, but it was the only way to scare away the human form. I narrated to her the way Don Juan made me understand what was meant by impeccability. He and I were hiking one day through a very steep ravine when a huge boulder got loose from its matrix on the rock wall and came down with a formidable force and landed on the floor of the canyon, 20 or 30 yards from where we were standing. The size of the boulder made its fall a very impressive event. Don Juan seized the opportunity to create a dramatic lesson. He said that the force that rules our destinies is outside of ourselves and has nothing to do with our acts or volition. Sometimes that force would make us stop walking on our way and bend over to tie our shoelaces, as I had just done. And by making us stop, that force makes us gain a precious moment. If we had kept on walking, that enormous boulder would have most certainly crushed us to death. Some other day, however, in another ravine the same outside deciding force would make us stop again to bend over and tie our shoelaces while another boulder would get loose precisely above where we are standing. By making us stop, that force would have made us lose a precious moment. That time if we had kept on walking, we would have saved ourselves. Don Juan said that in view of my total lack of control over the forces which decide my destiny, My only possible freedom in that ravine consisted in my tying my shoelaces impeccably. La Gorda seemed to be moved by my account. For an instant she held my face in her hands from across the table. Impeccability for me is to tell you, at the right time, what the Nagual told me to tell you, she said. But power has to time perfectly what I have to reveal to Juan, or it won't have any effect. She paused in a dramatic fashion. Her delay was very studied but terribly effective with me. What is it? I asked desperately. She did not answer. She took me by the arm and led me to the area just outside the front door. She made me sit on the hard-packed ground with my back against a thick pole about 1.5 feet high that looked like a tree stump which had been planted in the ground almost against the wall of the house. There was a row of 5 such poles planted about 2 feet apart. I had meant to ask La Gorda what their function was. My first impression had been that a former owner of the house had tied animals to them. My conjecture seemed incongruous, however, because the area just outside the front door was a kind of roofed porch. I told La Gorda my supposition as she sat down next to me to my left, with her back against another pole. She laughed and said that the poles were indeed used for tying animals of sorts, but not by a former owner, and that she had nearly broken her back digging the holes for them. What do you use them for? I asked. Let's say that we tie ourselves to them, she replied. And this brings me to the next thing the Nagual asked me to tell you. He said that because you were empty he had to gather your second attention, your attention of the Nagual, in a way different than ours. We gathered that attention through dreaming and you did it with his power plants. The Nagual said that his power plants gathered the menacing side of your second attention in one clump, and that's the shape that came out of your head. He said that that's what happens to sorcerers when they are given power plants. If they don't die, the power plants spin their second attention into that awful shape that comes out of their heads. Now we're coming to what he wanted you to do. He said that you must change directions now and begin gathering your second attention in another way, more like us. You can't keep on the path of knowledge unless you balance your second attention. So far, that attention of yours has been riding on the Nagual's power, but now you are alone. That's what he wanted me to tell you. How do I balance my second attention? You have to do dreaming the way we do it. Dreaming is the only way to gather the second attention without injuring it, without making it menacing and awesome. Your second attention is fixed on the awful side of the world, ours is on the beauty of it. You have to change sides and come with us. That's what you chose last night when you decided to go with us. Could that shape come out of me at any time? No. The Nagual said that it won't come out again until you're as old as he is. Your Nagual has already come out as many times as was needed. The Nagual and Genaro have seen to that. They used to tease it out of you. The Nagual told me that sometimes you were a hair away from dying because your second attention is very indulging. He said that once you even scared him, your Nagual attacked him and he had to sing to it to calm it down. But the worst thing happened to you in Mexico City. There he pushed you one day and you went into an office and in that office you went through the crack between the worlds. He intended only to dispel your attention of the tonal, you were worried sick over some stupid thing. But when he shoved you, your whole tonal shrunk and your entire being went through the crack. He had a hellish time finding you. He told me that for a moment he thought you had gone farther than he could reach. But then he saw you roaming around aimlessly and he brought you back. He told me that you went through the crack around 10 in the morning. So, on that day, 10 in the morning became your new time. My new time for what? For everything. If you remain a man you will die around that time. If you become a sorcerer you will leave this world around that time. Eligio also went on a different path, a path none of us knew about. We met him just before he left. Eligio was a most marvelous dreamer. He was so good that the Nagual and Genaro used to take him through the crack and he had the power to withstand it, as if it were nothing. He didn't even pant. The Nagual and Genaro gave him a final boost with power plants. He had the control and the power to handle that boost. And that's what sent him to wherever he is. The Genros told me that Eligio jumped with Benigno. Is that true? Sure? By the time Eligio had to jump, his second attention had already been in that other world. The Nagual said that yours had also been there, but that for you it was a nightmare because you had no control. He said that his power plants had made you lopsided, they had made you cut through your attention of the tonal and had put you directly in the realm of your second attention, but without any mastery over that attention. The Nagual didn't give power plants to Eligio until the very last. Do you think that my second attention has been injured, Garda? The Nagual never said that. He thought you were dangerously crazy, but that has nothing to do with power plants. He said that both of your attentions are unmanageable. If you could conquer them you'd be a great warrior. I wanted her to tell me more on the subject. She put her hand on my writing pad and said that we had a terribly busy day ahead of us and we needed to store energy in order to withstand it. We had, therefore, to energize ourselves with the sunlight. She said that the circumstances required that we take the sunlight with the left eye. She began to move her head slowly from side to side as she glanced directly into the sun through her half-closed eyes. A moment later Lydia, Rosa and Josefina joined us. Lydia sat to my right, Josefina sat next to her, while Rosa sat next to La Gorda. All of them were resting their backs against the poles. I was in the middle of the row. It was a clear day. The sun was just above the distant range of mountains. They started moving their heads in perfect synchronization. I joined them and had the feeling that I too had synchronized my motion with theirs. They kept it up for about a minute and then stopped. All of them wore hats and used the brims to protect their faces from the sunlight when they were not bathing their eyes in it. La Gorda had given me my old hat to wear. We sat there for about half an hour. In that time we repeated the exercise countless times. I intended to make a mark on my pad for each time but La Gorda very casually pushed my pad out of reach. Lydia suddenly stood up, mumbling something unintelligible. La Gorda leaned over to me and whispered that the Genros were coming up the road. I strained to look but there was no one in sight. Rosa and Josefina also stood up and then went with Lydia inside the house. I told La Gorda that I could not see anyone approaching. She replied that the Genros had been visible at one point on the road and added that she had dreaded the moment when all of us would have to get together, but that she was confident that I could handle the situation. She advised me to be extra careful with Josefina and Pablito because they had no control over themselves. She said that the most sensible thing for me to do would be to take the Genros away after an hour or so. I kept looking at the road. There was no sign of anyone approaching. Are you sure they're coming? I asked. She said that she had not seen them but that Lydia had. The Genros had been visible just for Lydia because she had been gazing at the same time she had been bathing her eyes. I was not sure what La Gorda had meant and asked her to explain. We are gazers, she said. Just like yourself. We are all the same. There is no need to deny that you're a gazer. The Nagual told us about your great feats of gazing. My great feats of gazing? What are you talking about, Garda? She contracted her mouth and appeared to be on the verge of being irritated by my question. She seemed to catch herself. She smiled and gave me a gentle shove. At that moment she had a sudden flutter in her body. She stared blankly past me, then she shook her head vigorously. She said that she had just seen that the Genros were not coming after all, it was too early for them. They were going to wait for a while before they made their appearance. She smiled as if she were delighted with the delay. It's too early for us to have them here anyway, she said. And they feel the same way about us. Where are they now? I asked. They must be sitting beside the road somewhere, she replied. Benigno had no doubt gazed at the house as they were walking and saw us sitting here and that's why they have decided to wait. That's perfect. That will give us time. You scare me, Gorda. Time for what? You have to round up your second attention today, just for us four. How can I do that? I don't know. You are very mysterious to us. The Nagual has done scores of things to you with his power plants, but you can't claim that as knowledge. That is what I've been trying to tell you. Only if you have mastery over your second attention can you perform with it, otherwise you'll always stay fixed halfway between the two, as you are now. Everything that has happened to you since you arrived has been directed to force that attention to spin. I've been giving you instructions little by little, just as the Nagual told me to do. Since you took another path, you don't know the things that we know, just like we don't know anything about power plants. Soldan knows a bit more, because the Nagual took her to his homeland. Nestor knows about medicinal plants, but none of us has been taught the way you were. We don't need your knowledge yet. But someday when we are ready you are the one who will know what to do to give us a boost with power plants. I am the only one who knows where the Nagual's pipe is hidden, waiting for that day. The Nagual's command is that you have to change your path and go with us. That means that you have to do dreaming with us and stalking with the Genros. You can't afford any longer to be where you are, on the awesome side of your second attention. Another jolt of your Nagual coming out of you could kill you. The Nagual told me that human beings are frail creatures composed of many layers of luminosity. When you see them, they seem to have fibers, but those fibers are really layers, like an onion. Jolts of any kind separate those layers and can even cause human beings to die. She stood up and led me back to the kitchen. We sat down facing each other. Lydia, Rosa and Josefina were busy in the yard. I could not see them but I could hear them talking and laughing. The Nagual said that we die because our layers become separated, LaGuardia said. Jolts are always separating them but they get together again. Sometimes, though, the jolt is so great that the layers get loose and can't get back together anymore. Have you ever seen the layers, Garda? Sure? I saw a man dying in the street. The Nagual told me that you also found a man dying, but you didn't see his death. The Nagual made me see the dying man's layers. They were like the peels of an onion. When human beings are healthy they are like luminous eggs, but if they are injured they begin to peel, like an onion. The Nagual told me that your second attention was so strong sometimes that it pushed all the way out. He and Gennaro had to hold your layers together, otherwise you would have died. That's why he figured that you might have enough energy to get your Nagual out of you twice. He meant that you could hold your layers together by yourself twice. You did it more times than that and now you are finished. You have no more energy to hold your layers together in case of another jolt. The Nagual has entrusted me to take care of everyone. In your case, I have to help you to tighten your layers. The Nagual said that death pushes the layers apart. He explained to me that the center of our luminosity, which is the attention of the Nagual, is always pushing out, and that's what loosens the layers. So it's easy for death to come in between them and push them completely apart. Sorcerers have to do their best to keep their own layers closed. That's why the Nagual taught us dreaming. Dreaming tightens the layers. When sorcerers learn dreaming they tie together their two attentions and there is no more need for that center to push out. Do you mean that sorcerers do not die? That is right. Sorcerers do not die. Do you mean that none of us is going to die? I didn't mean us. We are nothing. We are freaks, neither here nor there. I meant sorcerers. The Nagual and Gennaro are sorcerers. Their two attentions are so tightly together that perhaps they'll never die. Did the Nagual say that, Garda? Yes. He and Gennaro both told me that. Not too long before they left, the Nagual explained to us the power of attention. I never knew about the tonal and the Nagual until then. LaGuardia recounted the way Don Juan had instructed them about that crucial tonal and Nagual dichotomy. She said that one day the Nagual had all of them gathered together in order to take them for a long hike to a desolate, rocky valley in the mountains. He made a large, heavy bundle with all kinds of items, he even put Pablito's radio in it. He then gave the bundle to Josefina to carry and put a heavy table on Pablito's shoulders and they all started hiking. He made all of them take turns carrying the bundle and the table as they hiked nearly 40 miles to that high, desolate place. When they arrived there, the Nagual made Pablito set the table in the very center of the valley. Then he asked Josefina to arrange the contents of the bundle on the table. When the table was filled, he explained to them the difference between the tonal and the Nagual, in the same terms he had explained it to me in a restaurant in Mexico City, except that in their case his example was infinitely more graphic. He told them that the tonal was the order that we are aware of in our daily world and also the personal order that we carry through life on our shoulders, like they had carried that table and the bundle. The personal tonal of each of us was like the table in that valley, a tiny island filled with the things we are familiar with. The Nagual, on the other hand, was the inexplicable source that held that table in place and was like the vastness of that deserted valley. He told them that sorcerers were obligated to watch their tonals from a distance in order to have a better grasp of what was really around them. He made them walk to a ridge from where they could view the whole area. From there the table was hardly visible. He then made them go back to the table and had them all loom over it in order to show that an average man does not have the grasp that a sorcerer has, because an average man is right on top of his table, holding on to every item on it. He then made each of them, one at a time, casually look at the objects on the table, and tested their recall by taking something and hiding it, to see if they had been attentive. All of them passed the test with flying colors. He pointed out to them that their ability to remember so easily the items on that table was due to the fact that all of them had developed their attention of the tonal, or their attention over the table. He next asked them to look casually at everything that was on the ground underneath the table, and tested their recall by removing the rocks, twigs or whatever else was there. None of them could remember what they had seen under the table. The Nagual then swept everything off the top of the table and made each of them, one at a time, lie across it on their stomachs and carefully examine the ground underneath. He explained to them that for a sorcerer the Nagual was the area just underneath the table. Since it was unthinkable to tackle the immensity of the Nagual, as exemplified by that vast, desolate place, sorcerers took as their domain of activity the area directly below the island of the tonal, as graphically shown by what was underneath that table. That area was the domain of what he called the second attention, or the attention of the Nagual, or the attention you under the table. That attention was reached only after warriors had swept the top of their tables clean. He said that reaching the second attention made the two attentions into a single unit, and that unit was the totality of oneself. La Gorda said that his demonstration was so clear to her that she understood at once why the Nagual had made her clean her own life, sweep her island of the tonal, as he had called it. She felt that she had indeed been fortunate in having followed every suggestion that he had put to her. She was still a long way from unifying her two attentions, but her diligence had resulted in an impeccable life, which was, as he had assured her, the only way for her to lose her human form. Losing the human form was the essential requirement for unifying the two attentions. The attention under the table is the key to everything sorcerers do, she went on. In order to reach that attention, the Nagual and Gennaro taught us dreaming, and you were taught about power plants. I don't know what they did to you to teach you how to trap your second attention with power plants, but to teach us how to do dreaming, the Nagual taught us gazing. He never told us what he was really doing to us. He just taught us to gaze. We never knew that gazing was the way to trap our second attention. We thought gazing was just for fun. That was not so. Dreamers have to be gazers before they can trap their second attention. The first thing the Nagual did was to put a dry leaf on the ground and make me look at it for hours. Every day he brought a leaf and put it in front of me. At first I thought that it was the same leaf that he saved from day to day, but then I noticed that leaves are different. The Nagual said that when we realize that, we are not looking anymore, but gazing. Then he put stacks of dry leaves in front of me. He told me to scramble them with my left hand and feel them as I gazed at them. A dreamer moves the leaves in spirals, gazes at them and then dreams of the designs that the leaves make. The Nagual said that dreamers can consider themselves as having mastered leaf gazing when they dream the designs of the leaves first and then find those same designs the next day in their pile of dry leaves. The Nagual said that gazing at leaves fortifies the second attention. If you gaze at a pile of leaves for hours, as he used to make me do, your thoughts get quiet. Without thoughts, the attention of the tonal wanes and suddenly your second attention hooks onto the leaves and the leaves become something else. The Nagual called the moment when the second attention hooks onto something stopping the world. And that is correct, the world stops. For this reason there should always be someone around when you gaze. We never know about the quirks of our second attention. Since we have never used it, we have to become familiar with it before we could venture into gazing alone. The difficulty in gazing is to learn to quiet down the thoughts. The Nagual said that he preferred to teach us how to do that with a pile of leaves because we could get all the leaves we needed any time we wanted to gaze. But anything else would do the same job. Once you can stop the world, you are a gazer. And since the only way of stopping the world is by trying, the Nagual made all of us gaze at dry leaves for years and years. I think it's the best way to reach our second attention. He combined gazing at dry leaves and looking for our hands in dreaming. It took me about a year to find my hands, and 4 years to stop the world. The Nagual said that once you have trapped your second attention with dry leaves, you do gazing and dreaming to enlarge it. And that's all there is to gazing. You make it sound so simple, Gorda. Everything the Toltecs do is very simple. The Nagual said that all we needed to do in order to trap our second attention was to try and try. All of us stopped the world by gazing at dry leaves. You and Eligio were different. You yourself did it with power plants, but I don't know what path the Nagual followed with Eligio. He never wanted to tell me. He told me about you because we have the same task. I mentioned that I had written in my notes that I had had the first complete awareness of having stopped the world only a few days before. She laughed. You stopped the world before any of us, she said. What do you think you did when you took all those power plants? You've never done it by gazing like we did, that's all. Was the pile of dry leaves the only thing the Nagual made you gaze at? Once dreamers know how to stop the world, they can gaze at other things, and finally when the dreamers lose their form altogether, they can gaze at anything. I do that. I can go into anything. He made us follow a certain order in gazing, though. First we gazed at small plants. The Nagual warned us that small plants are very dangerous. Their power is concentrated, they have a very intense light and they feel when dreamers are gazing at them, they immediately move their light and shoot it at the gazer. Dreamers have to choose one kind of plant to gaze at. Next we gazed at trees. Dreamers also have a particular kind of tree to gaze at. In this respect you and I are the same, both of us are eucalyptus gazers. By the look on my face she must have guessed my next question. The Nagual said that with his smoke you could very easily get your second attention to work, she went on. You focused your attention lots of times on the Nagual's predilection, the crows. He said that once, your second attention focused so perfectly on a crow that it flew away, like a crow flies, to the only eucalyptus tree that was around. For years I had dwelled upon that experience. I could not regard it in any other way except as an inconceivably complex hypnotic state, brought about by the psychotropic mushrooms contained in Don Juan's smoking mixture in conjunction with his expertise as a manipulator of behavior. He suggested a perceptual catharsis in me, that of turning into a crow and perceiving the world as a crow. The result was that I perceived the world in a manner that could not have possibly been part of my inventory of past experiences. La Gorda's explanation somehow had simplified everything. She said that the Nagual next made them gaze at moving, living creatures. He told them that small insects were by far the best subject. Their mobility made them innocuous to the gazer, the opposite of plants which drew their light directly from the earth. The next step was to gaze at rocks. She said that rocks were very old and powerful and had a specific light which was rather greenish in contrast with the white light of plants and the yellowish light of mobile, living beings. Rocks did not open up easily to gazers, but it was worthwhile for gazers to persist because rocks had special secrets concealed in their core, secrets that could aid sorcerers in their dreaming. What are the things that rocks reveal to you? I asked. When I gaze into the very core of the rock, she said, I always catch a whiff of a special scent proper to that rock. When I roam around in my dreaming, I know where I am because I'm guided by those scents. She said that the time of the day was an important factor in tree and rock gazing. In the early morning trees and rocks were stiff and their light was faint. Around noon was when they were at their best, and gazing at that time was done for borrowing their light and power. In the late afternoon and early evening trees and rocks were quiet and sad, especially trees. LaGuardia said that at that hour trees gave the feeling that they were gazing back at the gazer. A second series in the order of gazing was to gaze at cyclic phenomena, rain and fog. She said that gazers can focus their second attention on the rain itself and move with it, or focus it on the background and use the rain as a magnifying glass of sorts to reveal hidden features. Places of power or places to be avoided are found by gazing through rain. Places of power are yellowish and places to be avoided are intensely green. LaGuardia said that fog was unquestionably the most mysterious thing on earth for a gazer and that it could be used in the same two ways that rain was used. But it did not easily yield to women, and even after she had lost her human form, it remained unattainable to her. She said that the Nagual once made her see a green mist at the head of a fog bank and told her that was the second attention of a fog gazer who lived in the mountains where she and the Nagual were, and that he was moving with the fog. She added that fog was used to uncover the ghosts of things that were no longer there and that the true feat of fog gazers was to let their second attention go into whatever their gazing was revealing to them. I told her that once while I was with Don Juan I had seen a bridge formed out of a fog bank. I was aghast at the clarity and precise detail of that bridge. To me it was more than real. The scene was so intense and vivid that I had been incapable of forgetting it. Don Juan's comments had been that I would have to cross that bridge someday. I know about it, she said. The Nagual told me that someday when you have mastery over your second attention you'll cross that bridge with that attention, the same way you flew like a crow with that attention. He said that if you become a sorcerer, a bridge will form for you out of the fog and you will cross it and disappear from this world forever. Just like he himself has done. Did he disappear like that, over a bridge? Not over a bridge. But you witnessed how he and Gennaro stepped into the crack between the worlds in front of your very eyes. Nestor said that only Gennaro waved his hand to say goodbye the last time you saw them. The Nagual did not wave because he was opening the crack. The Nagual told me that when the second attention has to be called upon to assemble itself, all that is needed is the motion of opening that door. That's the secret of the Toltec dreamers once they are formless. I wanted to ask her about Don Juan and Don Gennaro stepping through that crack. She made me stop with a light touch of her hand on my mouth. She said that another series was distance and cloud gazing. In both, the effort of gazers was to let their second attention go to the place they were gazing at. Thus, they covered great distances or rode on clouds. In the case of cloud gazing, the Nagual never permitted them to gaze at thunderheads. He told them that they had to be formless before they could attempt that feat, and that they could not only ride on a thunderhead but on a thunderbolt itself. LaGuardia laughed and asked me to guess who would be daring and crazy enough actually to try gazing at thunderheads. I could think of no one else but Josefina. LaGuardia said that Josefina tried gazing at thunderheads every time she could when the Nagual was away, until one day a thunderbolt nearly killed her. Gennaro was a thunderbolt sorcerer, she went on. His first two apprentices, Benigno and Nestor, were singled out for him by his friend the Thunder. He said that he was looking for plants in a very remote area where the Indians are very private and don't like visitors of any kind. They had given Gennaro permission to be on their land since he spoke their language. Gennaro was picking some plants when it began to rain. There were some houses around but the people were unfriendly and he didn't want to bother them. He was about to crawl into a hole when he saw a young man coming down the road riding a bicycle heavily laden with goods. It was Benigno, the man from the town, who dealt with those Indians. His bicycle got stuck in the mud and right there a thunderbolt struck him. Gennaro thought that he had been killed. People in the houses had seen what happened and came out. Benigno was more scared than hurt, but his bicycle and all his merchandise were ruined. Gennaro stayed with him for a week and cured him. Almost the same thing happened to Nestor. He used to buy medicinal plants from Gennaro, and one day he followed him into the mountains to see where he picked his plants, so he wouldn't have to pay for them anymore. Gennaro went very far into the mountains on purpose. He intended to make Nestor get lost. It wasn't raining but there were thunderbolts, and suddenly a thunderbolt struck the ground and ran over the dry ground like a snake. It ran right between Nestor's legs and hit a rock 10 yards away. Gennaro said that the bolt had charred the inside of Nestor's legs. His testicles were swollen and he got very ill. Gennaro had to cure him for a week right in those mountains. By the time Benigno and Nestor were cured, they were also hooked. Men have to be hooked. Women don't need that. Women go freely into anything. That's their power and at the same time their drawback. Men have to be led and women have to be contained. She giggled and said that no doubt she had a lot of maleness in her, for she needed to be led, and that I must have a lot of femaleness in me, for I needed to be contained. The last series was fire, smoke and shadow gazing. She said that for a gazer, fire is not bright but black, and so is smoke. Shadows, on the other hand, are brilliant and have color and movement in them. There were 2 more things that were kept separate, star and water gazing. Stargazing was done by sorcerers who have lost their human form. She said that she had fared very well at stargazing, but could not handle gazing at water, especially running water, which was used by formless sorcerers to gather their second attention and transport it to any place they needed to go. All of us are terrified of water, she went on. A river gathers the second attention and takes it away and there is no way of stopping. The Nagual told me about your feats of water gazing. But he also told me that one time you nearly disintegrated in the water of a shallow river and that you can't even take a bath now. Don Juan had made me stare at the water of an irrigation ditch behind his house various times while he had me under the influence of his smoking mixture. I had experienced inconceivable sensations. Once I saw myself all green as if I were covered with algae. After that he recommended that I avoid water. Has my second attention been injured by water? I asked. It has, she replied. You are a very indulging man. The Nagual warned you to be cautious, but you went beyond your limits with running water. The Nagual said that you could have used water like no one else, but it wasn't your fate to be moderate. She pulled her bench closer to mine. That's all there is to gazing, she said. But there are other things I must tell you before you leave. What things, Garda? First of all, before I say anything, you must round up your second attention for the little sisters and me. I don't think I can do that. La Gorda stood up and went into the house. She came back a moment later with a small, thick, round cushion made out of the same natural fiber used in making nets. Without saying a word she led me again to the front porch. She said that she had made that cushion herself for her comfort when she was learning to gaze, because the position of the body was of great importance while one was gazing. One had to sit on the ground on a soft mat of leaves, or on a cushion made out of natural fibers. The back had to be propped against a tree, or a stump, or a flat rock. The body had to be thoroughly relaxed. The eyes were never fixed on the object, in order to avoid tiring them. The gaze consisted in scanning very slowly the object gazed at, going counterclockwise but without moving the head. She added that the Nagual had made them plant those thick poles so they could use them to prop themselves. She had me sit on her cushion and prop my back against a pole. She told me that she was going to guide me in gazing at a power spot that the Nagual had in the round hills across the valley. She hoped that by gazing at it I would get the necessary energy to round up my second attention. She sat down very close to me, to my left, and began giving me instructions. Almost in a whisper she told me to keep my eyelids half closed and stare at the place where two enormous round hills converged. There was a narrow, steep water canyon there. She said that that particular gazing consisted of 4 separate actions. The first one was to use the brim of my hat as a visor to shade off the excessive glare from the sun and allow only a minimal amount of light to come to my eyes, then to half close my eyelids. The third step was to sustain the opening of my eyelids in order to maintain a uniform flow of light, and the fourth step was to distinguish the water canyon in the background through the mesh of light fibers on my eyelashes. I could not follow her instructions at first. The sun was high over the horizon and I had to tilt my head back. I tipped my hat until I had blocked off most of the glare with the brim. That seemed to be all that was needed. As soon as I half closed my eyes, a bit of light that appeared as if it were coming from the tip of my hat literally exploded on my eyelashes, which were acting as a filter that created a web of light. I kept my eyelids half closed and played with the web of light for a moment until I could distinguish the dark, vertical outline of the water canyon in the background. La Gorda told me then to gaze at the middle part of the canyon until I could spot a very dark brown blotch. She said that it was a hole in the canyon which was not there for the eye that looks, but only for the eye that sees. She warned me that I had to exercise my control as soon as I had isolated that blotch, so that it would not pull me toward it. Rather, I was supposed to zoom in on it and gaze into it. She suggested that the moment I found the hole I should press my shoulders on hers to let her know. She slid sideways until she was leaning on me. I struggled for a moment to keep the 4 actions coordinated and steady, and suddenly a dark spot was formed in the middle of the canyon. I noticed immediately that I was not seeing it in the way I usually see. The dark spot was rather an impression, a visual distortion of sorts. The moment my control waned it disappeared. It was in my field of perception only if I kept the 4 actions under control. I remembered then that Don Juan had engaged me countless times in a similar activity. He used to hang a small piece of cloth from a low branch of a bush, which was strategically located to be in line with specific geological formations in the mountains in the background, such as water canyons or slopes. By making me sit about 50 feet away from that piece of cloth, and having me stare through the low branches of the bush where the cloth hung, he used to create a special perceptual effect in me. The piece of cloth, which was always a shade darker than the geological formation I was staring at, seemed to be at first a feature of that formation. The idea was to let my perception play without analyzing it. I failed every time because I was thoroughly incapable of suspending judgment, and my mind always entered into some rational speculation about the mechanics of my phantom perception. This time I felt no need whatsoever for speculations. La Gorda was not an imposing figure that I unconsciously needed to fight, as Don Juan had obviously been to me. The dark blotch in my field of perception became almost black. I leaned on La Gorda's shoulder to let her know. She whispered in my ear that I should struggle to keep my eyelids in the position they were in and breathe calmly from my abdomen. I should not let the blotch pull me, but gradually go into it. The thing to avoid was letting the hole grow and suddenly engulf me. In the event that that happened, I had to open my eyes immediately. I began to breathe as she had prescribed, and thus I could keep my eyelids fixed indefinitely at the appropriate aperture. I remained in that position for quite some time. Then I noticed that I had begun to breathe normally and that it had not disturbed my perception of the dark blotch. But suddenly the dark blotch began to move, to pulsate, and before I could breathe calmly again, the blackness moved forward and enveloped me. I became frantic and opened my eyes. La Gorda said that I was doing distance gazing and for that it was necessary to breathe the way she had recommended. She urged me to start all over again. She said that the Nagual used to make them sit for entire days rounding up their second attention by gazing at that spot. He cautioned them repeatedly about the danger of being engulfed because of the jolt the body suffered. It took me about an hour of gazing to do what she had delineated. To zoom in on the brown spot and gaze into it meant that the brown patch in my field of perception lightened up quite suddenly. As it became clearer, I realized that something in me was performing an impossible act. I felt that I was actually advancing toward that spot, thus the impression I was having that it was clearing up. Then I was so near to it that I could distinguish features in it, like rocks and vegetation. I came even closer and could look at a peculiar formation on one rock. It looked like a roughly carved chair. I liked it very much. Compared to it, the rest of the rocks seemed pale and uninteresting. I don't know how long I gazed at it. I could focus on every detail of it. I felt that I could lose myself forever in its detail because there was no end to it. But something dispelled my view. Another strange image was superimposed on the rock, and then another one, and another yet. I became annoyed with the interference. At the instant I became annoyed, I also realized that La Gorda was moving my head from side to side from behind me. In a matter of seconds the concentration of my gazing had been thoroughly dissipated. La Gorda laughed and said that she understood why I had caused the Nagual such an intense concern. She had seen for herself that I indulged beyond my limits. She sat against the pole next to me and said that she and the little sisters were going to gaze into the Nagual's power place. She then made a piercing bird call. A moment later the little sisters came out of the house and sat down to gaze with her. Their gazing mastery was obvious. Their bodies acquired a strange rigidity. They did not seem to be breathing at all. Their stillness was so contagious that I caught myself half closing my eyes and staring into the hills. Gazing had been a true revelation to me. In performing it I had corroborated some important issues of Don Juan's teachings. La Gorda had delineated the task in a definitely vague manner. To zoom in on it was more a command than a description of a process, and yet it was a description, providing that one essential requirement had been fulfilled. Don Juan had called that requirement stopping the internal dialogue. From La Gorda's statements about gazing it was obvious to me that the effect Don Juan had been after in making them gaze was to teach them to stop the internal dialogue. La Gorda had expressed it as quieting down the thoughts. Don Juan had taught me to do that very same thing, although he had made me follow the opposite path. Instead of teaching me to focus my view, as gazers did, he taught me to open it, to flood my awareness by not focusing my sight on anything. I had to sort of feel with my eyes everything in the 180-degree range in front of me, while I kept my eyes unfocused just above the line of the horizon. It was very difficult for me to gaze, because it entailed reversing that training. As I tried to gaze, my tendency was to open up. The effort of keeping that tendency in check, however, made me shut off my thoughts. Once I had turned off my internal dialogue, it was not difficult to gaze as La Gorda had prescribed. Don Juan had asserted time and time again that the essential feature of his sorcery was shutting off the internal dialogue. In terms of the explanation La Gorda had given me about the two realms of attention, stopping the internal dialogue was an operational way of describing the act of disengaging the attention of the tonal. Don Juan had also said that once we stop our internal dialogue we also stop the world. That was an operational description of the inconceivable process of focusing our second attention. He had said that some part of us is always kept under lock and key because we are afraid of it, and that to our reason, that part of us was like an insane relative that we keep locked in a dungeon. That part was, in La Gorda's terms, our second attention, and when it finally could focus on something the world stopped. Since we, as average men, know only the attention of the tonal, it is not too far-fetched to say that once that attention is cancelled, the world indeed has to stop. The focusing of our wild, untrained second attention has to be, perforce, terrifying. Don Juan was right in saying that the only way to keep that insane relative from bursting in on us was by shielding ourselves with our endless internal dialogue. La Gorda and the little sisters stood up after perhaps 30 minutes of gazing. La Gorda signaled me with her head to follow them. They went to the kitchen. La Gorda pointed to a bench for me to sit on. She said that she was going up the road to meet the Genros and bring them over. She left through the front door. The little sisters sat around me. Lydia volunteered to answer anything I wanted to ask her. I asked her to tell me about her gazing into Don Juan's power spot, but she did not understand me. "I'm a distance and shadow gazer," she said. "After I became a gazer, the Nagual made me start all over again and had me gaze this time at the shadows of leaves and plants and trees and rocks. Now I never look at anything anymore, I just look at their shadows. Even if there is no light at all, there are shadows, even at night there are shadows. Because I'm a shadow gazer, I'm also a distance gazer. I can gaze at shadows even in the distance. The shadows in the early morning don't tell much. The shadows rest at that time. So it's useless to gaze very early in the day. Around 6 in the morning the shadows wake up, and they are best around 5 in the afternoon. Then they are fully awake. What do the shadows tell you? Everything I want to know. They tell me things because they have heat, or cold, or because they move, or because they have colors. I don't know yet all the things that colors and heat and cold mean. The Nagual left it up to me to learn. How do you learn? In my dreaming. Dreamers must gaze in order to do dreaming, and then they must look for their dreams in their gazing. For example, the Nagual made me gaze at the shadows of rocks, and then in my dreaming I found out that those shadows had light, so I looked for the light in the shadows from then on until I found it. Gazing and dreaming go together. It took me a lot of gazing at shadows to get my dreaming of shadows going. And then it took me a lot of dreaming and gazing to get the two together and really see in the shadows what I was seeing in my dreaming. See what I mean? Every one of us does the same. Rose's dreaming is about trees because she's a tree gazer, and Josefina's is about clouds because she's a cloud gazer. They gaze at trees and clouds until they match their dreaming. Rosa and Josefina shook their heads in agreement. What about La Gorda? I asked. She's a flea gazer, Rosa said, and all of them laughed. La Gorda doesn't like to be bitten by fleas, Lydia explained. She is formless and can gaze at anything, but she used to be a rain gazer. What about Pablito? He gazes at women's crotches, Rosa answered with a deadpan expression. They laughed. Rosa slapped me on the back. I understand that since he's your partner he's taking after you, she said. They banged on the table and shook the benches with their feet as they laughed. Pablito is a rock gazer, Lydia said. Nestor is a rain and plant gazer, and Benigno is a distance gazer. But don't ask me any more about gazing because I will lose my power if I tell you more. How come La Gorda tells me everything? La Gorda lost her form, Lydia replied. Whenever I lose mine I'll tell you everything too. But by then you won't care to hear it. You care only because you're stupid like us. The day we lose our form we'll all stop being stupid. Why do you ask so many questions when you know all this? Rosa asked. Because he's like us, Lydia said. He's not a true Nagual. He is still a man. She turned and faced me. For an instant her face was hard and her eyes piercing and cold, but her expression softened as she spoke to me. You and Pablito are partners, she said. You really like him, don't you? I thought for a moment before I answered. I told her that somehow I trusted him implicitly. For no overt reason at all I had a feeling of kinship with him. You like him so much that you fouled him up, she said in an accusing tone. On that mountaintop where you jumped, he was getting to his second attention by himself and you forced him to jump with you. I only held him by the arm, I said in protest. A sorcerer doesn't hold another sorcerer by the arm, she said. Each of us is very capable. You don't need any of us three to help you, only a sorcerer who sees and is formless can help. On that mountaintop where you jumped, you were supposed to go first. Now Pablito is tied to you. I suppose you intended to help us in the same way. God, the more I think about you, the more I despise you. Rosa and Josefina mumbled their agreement. Rosa stood up and faced me with rage in her eyes. She demanded to know what I intended to do with them. I said that I intended to leave very soon. My statement seemed to shock them. They all spoke at the same time. Lydia's voice rose above the others. She said that the time to leave had been the night before, and that she had hated it the moment I decided to stay. Josefina began to yell obscenities at me. I felt a sudden shiver and stood up and yelled at them to be quiet with a voice that was not my own. They looked at me horrified. I tried to look casual, but I had frightened myself as much as I had frightened them. At that moment LaGuardia stepped out to the kitchen as if she had been hiding in the front room waiting for us to start a fight. She said that she had warned all of us not to fall into one another's webs. I had to laugh at the way she scolded us as if we were children. She said that we owed respect to each other, that respect among warriors was a most delicate matter. The little sisters knew how to behave like warriors with each other, so did the generals among themselves, but when I would come into either group, or when the two groups got together, all of them ignored their warriors' knowledge and behaved like slobs. We sat down. LaGuardia sat next to me. After a moment's pause Lydia explained that she was afraid I was going to do to them what I had done to Pablito. LaGuardia laughed and said that she would never let me help any of them in that manner. I told her that I could not understand what I had done to Pablito that was so wrong. I had not been aware of what I had done, and if Nestor had not told me I would never have known that I had actually picked Pablito up. I even wondered if Nestor had perhaps exaggerated a bit, or that maybe he had made a mistake. LaGuardia said that the witness would not make a stupid mistake like that, much less exaggerate it, and that the witness was the most perfect warrior among them. Sorcerers don't help one another like you helped Pablito, she went on. You behaved like a man in the street. The Nagual had taught us all to be warriors. He said that a warrior had no compassion for anyone. For him, to have compassion meant that you wished the other person to be like you, to be in your shoes, and you lent a hand just for that purpose. You did that to Pablito. The hardest thing in the world is for a warrior to let others be. When I was fat I worried because Lydia and Josefina did not eat enough. I was afraid that they would get ill and die from not eating. I did my utmost to fatten them and I meant only the best. The impeccability of a warrior is to let them be and to support them in what they are. That means, of course, that you trust them to be impeccable warriors themselves. But what if they are not impeccable warriors? I said. Then it's your duty to be impeccable yourself and not say a word, she replied. The Nagual said that only a sorcerer who sees and is formless can afford to help anyone. That's why he helped us and made us what we are. You don't think that you can go around picking people up off the street to help them, do you? Don Juan had already put me face to face with the dilemma that I could not help my fellow beings in any way. In fact, to his understanding, every effort to help on our part was an arbitrary act guided by our own self-interest alone. One day when I was with him in the city, I picked up a snail that was in the middle of the sidewalk and tucked it safely under some vines. I was sure that if I had left it in the middle of the sidewalk, people would sooner or later have stepped on it. I thought that by moving it to a safe place I had saved it. Don Juan pointed out that my assumption was a careless one, because I had not taken into consideration two important possibilities. One was that the snail might have been escaping a sure death by poison under the leaves of the vine, and the other possibility was that the snail had enough personal power to cross the sidewalk. By interfering I had not saved the snail but only made it lose whatever it had so painfully gained. I wanted, of course, to put the snail back where I had found it, but he did not let me. He said that it was the snail's fate that an idiot crossed its path and made it lose its momentum. If I left it where I had put it, it might be able again to gather enough power to go wherever it was going. I thought I had understood his point. Obviously I had only given him a shallow agreement. The hardest thing for me was to let others be. I told them the story. LaGuardia patted my back. We're all pretty bad, she said. All 5 of us are awful people who don't want to understand. I've gotten rid of most of my ugly side, but not all of it yet. We are rather slow, and in comparison to the generals we are gloomy and domineering. The Genros, on the other hand, are all like Gennaro, there is very little awfulness in them. The little sisters shook their heads in agreement. "You are the ugliest among us," Lydia said to me. "I don't think we're that bad in comparison to you." La Gorda giggled and tapped my leg as if telling me to agree with Lydia. I did, and all of them laughed like children. We remained silent for a long time. "I'm getting now to the end of what I had to tell you," La Gorda said all of a sudden. She made all of us stand up. She said that they were going to show me the Toltec warrior's power stand. Lydia stood by my right side, facing me. She grabbed my hand with her right hand, palm to palm, but without interlocking the fingers. Then she hooked my arm right above the elbow with her left arm and held me tightly against her chest. Josefina did exactly the same thing on my left side. Rosa stood face to face with me and hooked her arms under my armpits and grabbed my shoulders. La Gorda came from behind me and embraced me at my waist, interlocking her fingers over my navel. All of us were about the same height and they could press their heads against my head. La Gorda spoke very softly behind my left ear, but loud enough for all of us to hear her. She said that we were going to try to put our second attention in the Nagual's power place, without anyone nor anything prodding us. This time there was no teacher to aid us or allies to spur us. We were going to go there just by the force of our desire. I had the invincible urge to ask her what I should do. She said that I should let my second attention focus on what I had gazed at. She explained that the particular formation which we were in was a Toltec power arrangement. I was at that moment the center and binding force of the four corners of the world. Lydia was the east, the weapon that the Toltec warrior holds in his right hand. Rosa was the north, the shield harnessed on the front of the warrior. Josefina was the west, the spirit catcher that the warrior holds in his left hand, and La Gorda was the south, the basket which the warrior carries on his back and where he keeps his power objects. She said that the natural position of every warrior was to face the north, since he had to hold the weapon, the east, in his right hand. But the direction that we ourselves had to face was the south, slightly toward the east, therefore, the act of power that the Nagual had left for us to perform was to change directions. She reminded me that one of the first things that the Nagual had done to us was to turn our eyes to face the southeast. That had been the way he had enticed our second attention to perform the feat which we were going to attempt then. There were two alternatives to that feat. One was for all of us to turn around to face the south, using me as an axis, and in so doing change around the basic value and function of all of them. Lydia would be the west, Josefina, the east, Rosa, the south and she, the north. The other alternative was for us to change our direction and face the south but without turning around. That was the alternative of power, and it entailed putting on our second face. I told La Gorda that I did not understand what our second face was. She said that she had been entrusted by the Nagual to try getting the second attention of all of us bundled up together, and that every Toltec warrior had two faces and faced two opposite directions. The second face was the second attention. La Gorda suddenly released her grip. All the others did the same. She sat down again and motioned me to sit by her. The little sisters remained standing. La Gorda asked me if everything was clear to me. It was, and at the same time it was not. Before I had time to formulate a question, she blurted out that one of the last things the Nagual had entrusted her to tell me was that I had to change my direction by summing up my second attention together with theirs, and put on my power face to see what was behind me. La Gorda stood up and motioned me to follow her. She led me to the door of their room. She gently pushed me into the room. Once I had crossed the threshold, Lydia, Rosa, Josefina and she joined me, in that order, and then La Gorda closed the door. The room was very dark. It did not seem to have any windows. La Gorda grabbed me by the arm and placed me in what I thought was the center of the room. All of them surrounded me. I could not see them at all, I could only feel them flanking me on four sides. After a while my eyes became accustomed to the darkness. I could see that the room had two windows which had been blocked off by panels. A bit of light came through them and I could distinguish everybody. Then all of them held me the way they had done a few minutes before, and in perfect unison they placed their heads against mine. I could feel their hot breaths all around me. I closed my eyes in order to sum up the image of my gazing. I could not do it. I felt very tired and sleepy. My eyes itched terribly. I wanted to rub them, but Lydia and Josefina held my arms tightly. We stayed in that position for a very long time. My fatigue was unbearable and finally I slumped. I thought that my knees had given in. I had the feeling that I was going to collapse on the floor and fall asleep right there. But there was no floor. In fact, there was nothing underneath me. My fright upon realizing that was so intense that I was fully awake in an instant. A force greater than my fright, however, pushed me back into that sleepy state again. I abandoned myself. I was floating with them like a balloon. It was as if I had fallen asleep and was dreaming, and in that dream I saw a series of disconnected images. We were no longer in the darkness of their room. There was so much light that it blinded me. At times I could see Rose's face against mine. Out of the corner of my eyes I could also see Lydia's and Josefina's. I could feel their foreheads pressed hard against my ears. And then the image would change and I would see instead La Gorda's face against mine. Every time that happened she would put her mouth on mine and breathe. I did not like that at all. Some force in me tried to get loose. I felt terrified. I tried to push all of them away. The harder I tried, the harder they held me. That convinced me that La Gorda had tricked me and had finally led me into a death trap. But contrary to the others, La Gorda had been an impeccable player. The thought that she had played an impeccable hand made me feel better. At one point I did not care to struggle any longer. I became curious about the moment of my death, which I believed was imminent, and I let go of myself. I experienced then an unequaled joy, an exuberance that I was sure was the herald of my end, if not my death itself. I pulled Lydia and Josefina even closer to me. At that moment La Gorda was in front of me. I did not mind that she was breathing in my mouth, in fact I was surprised that she stopped then. The instant she did, all of them also stopped pressing their heads on mine. They began to look around and by so doing they also freed my head. I could move it. Lydia, La Gorda and Josefina were so close to me that I could see only through the opening in between their heads. I could not figure out where we were. One thing I was certain of, we were not standing on the ground. We were in the air. Another thing I knew for sure was that we had shifted our order. Lydia was to my left and Josefina, to my right. La Gorda's face was covered with perspiration and so were Lydia's and Josefina's. I could only feel Rosa behind me. I could see her hands coming from my armpits and holding onto my shoulders. La Gorda was saying something I could not hear. She enunciated her words slowly as if she were giving me time to read her lips, but I got caught up in the details of her mouth. At one instant I felt that the four of them were moving me, they were deliberately rocking me. That forced me to pay attention to La Gorda's silent words. I clearly read her lips this time. She was telling me to turn around. I tried but my head seemed to be fixed. I felt that someone was biting my lips. I watched La Gorda. She was not biting me but she was looking at me as she mouthed her command to turn my head around. As she talked, I also felt that she was actually licking my entire face or biting my lips and cheeks. La Gorda's face was somehow distorted. It looked big and yellowish. I thought that perhaps since the whole scene was yellowish, her face was reflecting that glow. I could almost hear her ordering me to turn my head around. Finally the annoyance that the biting was causing me made me shake my head. And suddenly the sound of La Gorda's voice became clearly audible. She was in back of me and she was yelling at me to turn my attention around. Rose was the one who was licking my face. I pushed her away from my face with my forehead. Rosa was weeping. Her face was covered with perspiration. I could hear La Gorda's voice behind me. She said that I had exhausted them by fighting them and that she did not know what to do to catch our original attention. The little sisters were whining. My thoughts were crystal clear. My rational processes, however, were not deductive. I knew things quickly and directly, and there was no doubt of any sort in my mind. For instance, I knew immediately that I had to go back to sleep again, and that would make us plummet down. But I also knew that I had to let them bring us to their house. I was useless for that. If I could focus my second attention at all, it had to be on a place that Don Juan had given me in northern Mexico. I had always been able to picture it in my mind like nothing else in the world. I did not dare to sum up that vision. I knew that we would have ended up there. I thought that I had to tell La Gorda what I knew, but I could not talk. Yet some part of me knew that she understood. I trusted her implicitly and I fell asleep in a matter of seconds. In my dream I was looking at the kitchen of their house. Pablito, Nestor and Benigno were there. They looked extraordinarily large and they glowed. I could not focus my eyes on them, because a sheet of transparent plastic material was in between them and myself. Then I realized that it was as if I were looking at them through a glass window while somebody was throwing water on the glass. Finally the glass shattered and the water hit me in the face. Pablito was drenching me with a bucket. Nestor and Benigno were also standing there. La Gorda, the little sisters and I were sprawled on the ground in the yard behind the house. The Genros were drenching us with buckets of water. I sprang up. Either the cold water or the extravagant experience I had just been through had invigorated me. La Gorda and the little sisters put on a change of clothes that the Genros must have laid out in the sun. My clothes had also been neatly laid on the ground. I changed without a word. I was experiencing the peculiar feeling that seems to follow the focusing of the second attention. I could not talk, or rather I could talk but I did not want to. My stomach was upset. La Gorda seemed to sense it and pulled me gently to the area in back of the fence. I became ill. La Gorda and the little sisters were affected the same way. I returned to the kitchen area and washed my face. The coldness of the water seemed to restore my awareness. Pablito, Nestor and Benigno were sitting around the table. Pablito had brought his chair. He stood up and shook hands with me. Then Nestor and Benigno did the same. La Gorda and the little sisters joined us. There seemed to be something wrong with me. My ears were buzzing. I felt dizzy. Josefina stood up and grabbed onto Rosa for support. I turned to ask La Gorda what to do. Lydia was falling backward over the bench. I caught her, but her weight pulled me down and I fell over with her. I must have fainted. I woke up suddenly. I was lying on a straw mat in the front room. Lydia, Rosa and Josefina were sound asleep next to me. I had to crawl over them to stand up. I nudged them but they did not wake up. I walked out to the kitchen. La Gorda was sitting with the Genros around the table. "Welcome back," Pablito said. He added that La Gorda had woken up a short while before. I felt that I was my old self again. I was hungry. La Gorda gave me a bowl of food. She said that they had already eaten. After eating I felt perfect in every respect except I could not think as I usually do. My thoughts had quieted down tremendously. I did not like that state. I noticed then that it was late afternoon. I had a sudden urge to jog in place facing the sun, the way Don Juan used to make me do. I stood up and La Gorda joined me. Apparently she had had the same idea. Moving like that made me perspire. I got winded very quickly and returned to the table. La Gorda followed me. We sat down again. The Genros were staring at us. La Gorda handed me my writing pad. "The Nagual here got us lost," La Gorda said. The moment she spoke I experienced a most peculiar bursting. My thoughts came back to me. In an avalanche. There must have been a change in my expression, for Pablito embraced me and so did Nestor and Benigno. "The Nagual is going to live," Pablito said loudly. La Gorda also seemed delighted. She wiped her forehead in a gesture of relief. She said that I had nearly killed all of them and myself with my terrible tendency to indulge. To focus the second attention is no joke, Nestor said. What happened to us, Garda? I asked. We got lost, she said. You began to indulge in your fear and we got lost in that immensity. We couldn't focus our attention of the tonal anymore. But we succeeded in bundling up our second attention with yours and now you have two faces. Lydia, Rosa and Josefina stepped out into the kitchen at that moment. They were smiling and seemed as fresh and vigorous as ever. They helped themselves to some food. They sat down and nobody uttered a word while they ate. The moment the last one had finished eating, La Gorda picked up where she had left off. Now you're a warrior with two faces, she went on. The Nagual said that all of us have to have two faces to fare well in both attentions. He and Jenna Earl helped us to round up our second attention and turned us around so we could face in two directions, but they didn't help you, because to be a true Nagual you have to claim your power all by yourself. You're still a long way from that, but let's say that now you're walking upright instead of crawling, and when you've regained your completeness and have lost your form, you'll be gliding. Benigno made a gesture with his hand of a plane in flight and imitated the roar of the engine with his booming voice. The sound was truly deafening. Everybody laughed. The little sisters seemed to be delighted. I had not been fully aware until then that it was late afternoon. I said to La Gorda that we must have slept for hours, for we had gone into their room before noon. She said that we had not slept long at all, that most of that time we had been lost in the other world, and that the Genros had been truly frightened and despondent, because there was nothing they could do to bring us back. I turned to Nestor and asked him what they had actually done or seen while we were gone. He stared at me for a moment before answering. We brought a lot of water to the yard, he said, pointing to some empty oil barrels. Then all of you staggered into the yard and we poured water on you, that's all. Did we come out of the room? I asked him. Benigno laughed loudly. Nestor looked at La Gorda as if asking for permission or advice. Did we come out of the room? La Gorda asked. No, Nestor replied. La Gorda seemed to be as anxious to know as I was, and that was alarming to me. She even coaxed Nestor to speak. You came from nowhere, Nestor said. I should also say that it was frightening. All of you were like fog. Pablito saw you first. You may have been in the yard for a long time, but we didn't know where to look for you. Then Pablito yelled and all of us saw you. We have never seen anything like that. What did we look like? I asked. The Genros looked at one another. There was an unbearably long silence. The little sisters were staring at Nestor with their mouths open. You were like pieces of fog caught in a web, Nestor said. When we poured water on you, you became solid again. I wanted him to keep on talking but La Gorda said that there was very little time left, for I had to leave at the end of the day and she still had things to tell me. The Genros stood up and shook hands with the little sisters and La Gorda. They embraced me and told me that they only need a day. Few days in order to get ready to move away. Pablito put his chair upside down on his back. Josefina ran to the area around the stove, picked up a bundle they had brought from Donna's old ad's house and placed it between the legs of Pablito's chair, which made an ideal carrying device. Since you're going home you might as well take this, she said. It belongs to you anyway. Pablito shrugged his shoulders and shifted his chair in order to balance the load. Nestor signaled Benigno to take the bundle but Pablito would not let him. It's all right, he said. I might as well be a jackass as long as I'm carrying this damn chair. Why do you carry it, Pablito? I asked. I have to store my power, he replied. I can't go around sitting on just anything. Who knows what kind of a creep sat there before me? He cackled and made the bundle wiggle by shaking his shoulders. After the Genros left, La Gorda explained to me that Pablito began his crazy involvement with his chair to tease Lydia. He did not want to sit where she had sat, but he had gotten carried away, and since he loved to indulge he would not sit anywhere else except on his chair. He is capable of carrying it through life, La Gorda said to me with great certainty. He's almost as bad as you. He's your partner, you'll carry your writing pad through life and he'll carry his chair. What's the difference? Both of you indulge more than the rest of us. The little sisters surrounded me and laughed, patting me on the back. It's very hard to get into our second attention, La Gorda went on, and to manage it when you indulge as you do is even harder. The Nagual said that you should know how difficult that managing is better than any of us. With his power plants, you learn to go very far into that other world. That's why you pulled us so hard today that we nearly died. We wanted to gather our second attention on the Nagual's spot, and you plunged us into something we didn't know. We are not ready for it, but neither are you. You can't help yourself, though, the power plants made you that way. The Nagual was right, all of us have to help you contain your second attention, and you have to help all of us to push ours. Your second attention can go very far, but it has no control, ours can go only a little bit, but we have absolute control over it. La Gorda and the little sisters, one by one, told me how frightening the experience of being lost in the other world had been. The Nagual told me, La Gorda went on, that when he was gathering your second attention with his smoke, you focused it on a gnat, and then the little gnat became the guardian of the other world for you. I told her that that was true. At her request I narrated to them the experience Don Juan had made me undergo. With the aid of his smoking mixture I had perceived a gnat as a 100-foot, horrifying monster that moved with incredible speed and agility. The ugliness of that creature was nauseating, and yet there was an awesome magnificence to it. I also had no way to accommodate that experience in my rational scheme of things. The only support for my intellect was my deep-seated certainty that one of the effects of the psychotropic smoking mixture was to induce me to hallucinate the size of the gnat. I presented to them, especially to La Gorda, my rational, causal explanation of what had taken place. They laughed. There are no hallucinations, La Gorda said in a firm tone. If anybody suddenly sees something different, something that was not there before, it is because that person's second attention has been gathered and that person is focusing it on something. Now, whatever is gathering that person's attention might be anything, maybe it's liquor, or maybe it's madness, or maybe it's the Nagual's smoking mixture. You saw a gnat and it became the guardian of the other world for you. And do you know what that other world is? That other world is the world of our second attention. The Nagual thought that perhaps your second attention was strong enough to pass the guardian and go into that world. But it wasn't. If it had been, you might have gone into that world and never returned. The Nagual told me that he was prepared to follow you. But the guardian didn't let you pass and nearly killed you. The Nagual had to stop making you focus your second attention with his power plants because you could only focus on the awesomeness of things. He had you do dreaming instead, so you could gather it in another way. But he was sure your dreaming would also be awesome. There was nothing he could do about it. You were following him in his own footsteps and he had an awesome, fearsome side. They remained silent. It was as if all of them had been engulfed by their memories. La Gorda said that the Nagual had once pointed out to me a very special red insect, in the mountains of his homeland. She asked me if I remembered it. I did remember it. Years before Don Juan had taken me to an area unknown to me, in the mountains of northern Mexico. With extreme care he showed me some round insects, the size of a ladybug. Their backs were brilliantly red. I wanted to get down on the ground and examine them, but he would not let me. He told me that I should watch them, without staring, until I had memorized their shape, because I was supposed to remember them always. He then explained some intricate details of their behavior, making it sound like a metaphor. He was telling me about the arbitrary importance of our most cherished mores. He pointed out some alleged mores of those insects and pitted them against ours. The comparison made the importance of our beliefs look ridiculous. Just before he and Jenna Earl left, La Gorda went on, the Nagual took me to that place in the mountains where those little bugs lived. I had already been there once, and so had everyone else. The Nagual made sure that all of us knew those little creatures, although he never let us gaze at them. While I was there with him, he told me what to do with you and what I should tell you. I've already told you most of what he asked me to, except for this last thing. It has to do with what you've been asking everybody about: where are the Nagual and Gennaro? Now I'll tell you exactly where they are. The Nagual said that you will understand this better than any of us. None of us has ever seen the Guardian. None of us has ever been in that yellow sulfur world where he lives. You are the only one among us who has. The Nagual said that he followed you into that world when you focused your second attention on the Guardian. He intended to go there with you, perhaps forever, if you would have been strong enough to pass. It was then that he first found out about the world of those little red bugs. He said that their world was the most beautiful and perfect thing one could imagine. So, when it was time for him and Gennaro to leave this world, they gathered all their second attention and focused it on that world. Then the Nagual opened the crack, as you yourself witnessed, and they slipped through it into that world, where they are waiting for us to join them someday. The Nagual and Gennaro liked beauty. They went there for their sheer enjoyment. She looked at me. I had nothing to say. She had been right in saying that power had to time her revelation perfectly if it were going to be effective. I felt an anguish I could not express. It was as if I wanted to weep and yet I was not sad or melancholy. I longed for something inexpressible, but that longing was not mine. Like so many of the feelings and sensations I had had since my arrival, it was alien to me. Nestor's assertions about Eligio came to my mind. I told LaGuardia what he had said, and she asked me to narrate to them the visions of my journey between the tonal and the Nagual which I had had upon jumping into the abyss. When I finished they all seemed frightened. LaGuardia immediately isolated my vision of the dome. The Nagual told us that our second attention would someday focus on that dome, she said. That day we will be all second attention, just like the Nagual and Gennaro are, and that day we will join them. Do you mean, Guardia, that we will go as we are? I asked. Yes, we will go as we are. The body is the first attention, the attention of the tonal. When it becomes the second attention, it simply goes into the other world. Jumping into the abyss gathered all your second attention for a while. But Eligio was stronger and his second attention was fixed by that jump. That's what happened to him and he was just like all of us. But there is no way of telling where he is. Even the Nagual himself didn't know. But if he is someplace he is in that dome. Or he is bouncing from vision to vision, perhaps for a whole eternity. LaGuardia said that in my journey between the tonal and the Nagual I had corroborated on a grand scale the possibility that our whole being becomes all second attention, and on a much smaller scale when I got all of them lost in the world of that attention, earlier that day, and also when she transported us half a mile in order to flee from the Allies. She added that the problem the Nagual had left for us as a challenge was whether or not we would be capable of developing our will, or the power of our second attention to focus indefinitely on anything we wanted. We were quiet for a while. It seemed that it was time for me to leave, but I could not move. The thought of Eligio's fate had paralyzed me. Whether he had made it to the dome of our rendezvous, or whether he had gotten caught in the tremendum, the image of his journey was maddening. It took no effort at all for me to envision it, for I had the experience of my own journey. The other world, which Don Juan had referred to practically since the moment we met, had always been a metaphor, an obscure way of labeling some perceptual distortion, or at best a way of talking about some undefinable state of being. Even though Don Juan had made me perceive indescribable features of the world, I could not consider my experiences to be anything beyond a play on my perception, a directed mirage of sorts that he had managed to make me undergo, either by means of psychotropic plants, or by means I could not deduce rationally. Every time that had happened I had shielded myself with the thought that the unity of the me I knew and was familiar with had been only temporarily displaced. Inevitably, as soon as that unity was restored, the world became again the sanctuary for my inviolable, rational self. The scope that LaGuardia had opened with her revelations was terrifying. She stood up and pulled me up off the bench. She said that I had to leave before the twilight set in. All of them walked with me to my car and we said goodbye. LaGuardia gave me a last command. She told me that on my return I should go directly to the Genro's house. "We don't want to see you until you know what to do," she said with a radiant smile. "But don't delay too long." The little sisters nodded. "Those mountains are not going to let us stay here much longer," she said, and with a subtle movement of her chin she pointed to the ominous, eroded hills across the valley. I asked her one more question. I wanted to know if she had any idea where the Nagual and Genaro would go after we had completed our rendezvous. She looked up at the sky, raised her arms and made an indescribable gesture with them to point out that there was no limit to that vastness.